Welcome back, everybody. So a few months ago, I was checking movie listings for something my kids wanted to watch, and I was just shocked to find that there was a fifth God's Not Dead movie in theaters. Like, seriously, another one of these things? I mean, the last one barely grossed over $1 million, so what are we even doing at this point? Still coasting on the $60 million glory days of God's Not Dead 1? Leaning on all the peripheral support and abstract political payouts of cause-driven movies that they know most people won't watch? Who knows? But one thing's for sure, they're not doing this for nothing. Some kind of milk is coming out of this thing, and as long as it is, they're going to keep squeezing the teat of this barely ever was franchise as long as humanly possible. And sorry for whatever mental image that gave you. And as long as they keep making these things, I'll probably still be here talking about it. And that might seem a little petty and unnecessary, but despite their meager box office performances, I'm afraid that these movies are still very culturally relevant. They stoke the craziest ideas of a small but radicalized evangelical core who is then going to be all too eager to go spread these ideas to other like-minded Christians. So I think it behooves us to have some idea of what these movies are talking about. So what are they talking about? What kind of poison is this franchise spreading throughout the Christian community? And by the way, I'm recording this part before I watch God's Not Dead 5 because I want to give you my raw thoughts about what I anticipate based on the franchise so far before I head into it. And up to this point, these movies have been telling us basically two things about Christianity. One, it's pretty much perpetually under attack in America by a combination of vague institutions and absurd cartoon stereotypes of atheists. And two, it has pretty much no authoritarian social agenda or even expectations of others, and all it wants to do is be loving and do good deeds. Now, this second part is never directly stated, but this franchise never says a single word about what Christianity thinks others shalt and shalt not do. And when you make 4 movies that are all about your religion and how it interacts with the society around it, and these expectations never come up once, I think it's safe to call you out for being a little bit coy. So, a quick overview of these movies and how they handle these two themes. God's Not Dead 1 has a Christian college student being forced to declare God is dead by an atheist professor. God's Not Dead 2 has a Christian teacher getting in trouble for making a benign secular reference to Jesus in her classroom. God's Not Dead 3 has a university trying to destroy a pastor's church. And God's Not Dead 4 has atheist social workers trying to take Christians' kids away from them because they're homeschooling. Now, you'll probably notice a couple things about these movies just from these quick synopses. First, the under attack in America thing is obvious just because of what these movies are about. I mean, I don't think the raw hysteria of these movies warrants a ton of explanation, right? Second, these movies get increasingly political. Starting with an absurd fantasy about a Christian kid being persecuted in an isolated environment, and then progressing further and further into Christian involvement in various social issues and even politics. 2 has Christians rallying around a highly publicized court case. 3 has a pastor taking his case for, the secular world not bulldozing his church, not only into court but into increasingly public forums. And 4 literally has Pastor Dave going to Congress to take up the political cause for parental rights in education. Meaning by this point he's as involved in politics as he could be without running for office. Wonder how that segues into God's Not Dead 5. And notice that as this political activism amps up, it never once involves Christians trying to, restrict gay rights or abortion rights or anything like that. The Christian agenda is always defensive. All it ever wants to do is protect itself against fake persecution concocted by the authors, which of course gets Christians thinking that their fight is actually about persecution of themselves and not control of others. So that's what I expect to see more of going into God's Not Dead 5. It's pretty obvious even before I start that this one's going to be the most overtly political. We already saw Pastor Dave go full-on school board meeting Karen on a bunch of politicians and then head to City Hall during the end credits, and from the previews of this one it's clear he's running for public office or something dumb like that. So my prediction is he does run for public office, not to push any kind of MAGA-adjacent Project 2025 agenda, but because, he's kind of forced into it after Christianity is figuratively tied to the railroad tracks by some atheist vaudeville villain of the week. Man, I'm getting so worn out with this stuff. But I guess if there's a plus side to this one, the ironically watching God's Not Dead nerd in me is kind of excited to see the cast of this one. We have Pete Kane, Mark Shelley, Josh Wheaton, and so many others it's like the Avengers of the Persecution cinematic universe. Give me the Jedi ghost of Professor Radisson offering heavenly advice to Pastor Dave, and I'll almost forget the bland stupidity of this movie and all the ways it's making us more doomed than we already are. Anyway, see you after I watch this movie, I guess. Now, less than a minute in and I'm already stopping to comment because we're already being subjected to some jarringly bad choices and the movie hasn't even started yet. Apparently, there were 3 studio names attached to this project, and the movie wanted to mention every single one of them. So it starts by rolling opening packages for Universal, Pinnacle Peak, and Great American Pure Flix. And they all play back-to-back in quick succession, which kind of ends up being a lot. I don't know, it just feels a little disorienting, maybe a little jarring to have every single one fade in, its own unique logo, its own unique music, then fade out, then the next one starts, then the next one starts. Maybe I'm nitpicking here. I know a lot of studios do something similar, but it seems like maybe they'll have 2 or something like that, and it's not done as badly as this. But what makes it even worse is that the first thing we see in this movie, and we get this immediately, totally cold after these other things run, is a news segment. And the first thing the segment plays is its opening package, fading into its own animation with its own music. So it seriously makes you feel like you're about to watch a 4th studio get introduced, and it took me a minute after seeing the words breaking news to recognize that's not what was happening. This is not only disorienting, but it makes it a little hard for the movie to set its tone, because one of these things is actually part of the movie, is supposed to be the tone of the movie, but you've already been through 4 different tone-setting musical sequences. I don't know. It's not important, except I guess that there's apparently a weird history with the names Pinnacle Peak and Pure Flix, but it's just another example of how bad these movies are in every little way. And not just bad, but kind of brazen in their lazy disregard for basic professionalism. Almost like they know they have a small but crystallized audience who is going to watch them no matter what, right? So anyway, this is not just news, but breaking news, with an announcement that a congressional incumbent named forgettable generic placeholder, Rick West, died of a heart attack, and so now his opponent is going to be running unopposed. And who was this opponent, you might ask? Pete Kane. Pete f***ing Kane, the bad guy lawyer from God's Not Dead 2. So our parade of classic characters starts less than a minute and a quarter into this movie, and I am here for it. Of course, the movie then has to take a giant dump on all my excitement by showing me how dumb it plans on being. They have this press conference with Kane about the fact that he's running unopposed, and one of the reporters asks him, and I made sure to get this down word for word, what about criticisms of your plans to pass laws to restrict religious freedoms and support bigger government? And Kane actually gets flustered by this instead of just saying, oh, I don't know. Nobody plans on doing that. Get the f*** out of here with your loaded language, you Newsmax freak. By the way, I think his handler is that guy from Happy Days who turned into a MAGA weirdo, so I guess birds of a feather, right? Anyway, this tells us everything about what this movie is, just in case we didn't know already. It knows that its audience feels that our political enemies love big government and want to persecute Christians is enough to neatly sum up everything they need to know about the political landscape, so it just runs with that. But just in case they hadn't driven that point home neatly enough, I'm going to need you to get all the way on the nose with that. Kane meets up with a bunch of liberal elite-coded fat cats to drink some alcohol, act happy his opponent is dead, insult Christians, and say he plans to reshape our nation's core. Also, look at this poor guy. All these guys look like volunteers from the local Baptist church, but I'm 90% sure this poor dude has no idea where he's at. But anyway, we get the point of the scene and, awesome. This is a God's Not Dead movie. We should have known what we were getting, right? News of this ripples through the community and throws the good guys, not explicitly called the Republicans in this movie, but we know who they are, into a panic because I guess the House is close to 50-50. One guy responds to the news with, if the House flips, hello socialism. So I guess instead of expounding on anything meaningful about anything at all, we're just kind of casually signifying things to our audience through general fear-mongering buzzwords. But wait, there is hope, so we learn. Because as everybody sits around watching video of Dave from his last movie and drooling over how amazing his unhinged meltdown was, they decide he should replace the dead guy to run for Congress. Meanwhile, back at the Hall of Justice, our hero Dave is learning that his Christian women's shelter is getting shut down due to government funding being pulled. Why? Because some of the women had a Bible study. Yeah, the government shut down a useful service because some of the people receiving it were privately practicing their religion. Sure, movie, okay, whatever. This would obviously be ironic at any time given how evangelicals feel about government funding for social programs being pulled. Hello, socialism. But this hits a little harder now, and you probably know why. But what it sets up is that our hero Dave, who really just wants to love others and sacrifice of himself and do good, is the hero our nation needs due to his being a man of God and his maximum oratory skills. It's almost like the person playing this character was creatively involved in the movie. Neil Breen. Now, Dave and Martin talk about all this, and I know Martin is our next character callback and stuff, but I'm so depressed about how stupid this is that I don't really care anyway. Martin's in all these anyway, so his appearance is boring. But we all know what Martin's here for. He compares everything that's happening to China locking up Christians, just in case this movie wasn't direct enough about demonizing the intentions of non-Christians. Then we see a scene of Mr. Smith telling a political strategist that he needs her to round out the team and run Dave's campaign. She, of course, has been out of the game too long or is too old for this shit or something. But Smith tells her she can't just huddle up at home with her kid and hide from this. Because if she doesn't help them fight back, the non-Christians will attack the Christians so fast she won't even have time to gather her son and run for the hills. Like seriously, I'm not joking. That's what this movie says.
And hiding in the mountains is not going to protect you from what's coming. You don't have time to pack, Lottie. That is what I've been trying to tell you. It might already be too late.
Then we see her reading a book to her kid and just adorably telling him how much she loves him. This kid, by the way, seemed to have been given instructions to talk like a baby, which just seems really weird considering how old he is. While Dave's at a fundraising carnival for his shelter being bad at ring toss, with like sweet music and innocent kids playing all around. Basically blasting us with virtue signals about how we are kind, innocent, simple country folk, while they're selfish, evil, big city power brokers. Also, she had some kind of reaction to the Happy Days guy as if they had some kind of history together. And so now that she has a kid, I'm just going to call it now and say that he's the dad and, something happened and she's upset by it or something like that. I don't know if I heard this before. I haven't seen that far into the movie when I say this, but, I don't know if this movie is just super obvious or I picked that up through cultural osmosis or the trailers or something like that. Yes, we'll see. At the carnival, the political strategist, Lottie J, by the way, so good job with those names movie, tries to get Dave to run for Congress. And in the process, she says that Kane hides behind the separation of church and state to chase God from politics in the public square and stuff. Which is obviously a classic thing for a movie like this to say, but no matter how many times we hear it, we cannot let ourselves get desensitized to it. Because keeping God out of politics and public institutions is very important for one simple reason. God can only manifest in politics through people's personal intuition about who he is and what he wants. Someone feels deep down that a certain kind of God exists and wants everybody to do this or that, a feeling usually rooted in some existing religious tradition or holy book, so they try to bring this idea into public or legal discourse. But this kind of personal intuition about the supernatural is just an absurd reason to make other people do things. Like, hey everybody, I've intuited that God wants us to do this or that, so it should be against the law. Nobody would ever put up with that from anybody other than themselves or people they agree with for existing religious reasons. I mean, if you're a Christian, you wouldn't want a Muslim coming at you with that garbage, right? Hell, not even another Christian you disagree with. That's exactly why we have the First Amendment, including the principle behind it that we paraphrase as separation of church and state. But what this movie's trying to suggest, of course, is that keeping God out of the public sphere is excluding Christians. Telling them they're not welcome to participate in civic life. But that's not what it's saying. Not at all. They are as welcome as anybody else to participate. They just have to follow the same rules as everybody else. Basically, if they want to propose a law, they need to be prepared to explain how it addresses demonstrable concerns about the consequences of our actions. Like everybody else does. They can't just insert their feelings and traditions about God's will into the law. Just like everybody else can't. I'm pretty sure this movie is going to lean heavily on muddying these two ideas, telling Christians that holding them to the same standard that everybody else is held to makes them second-class citizens. Basically, it's the thinking that lets evangelicals throw themselves on the floor and cry about being persecuted even as they're controlling others, and, we need to call them out for that. And the movie gets a little explicit about this when Miss J says that if Kane were elected, any institution with religious affiliation would be exempt from public funding. And this is just flatly wrong. Religious institutions can receive federal funding. They're just held to the same standards others are, even if probably very loosely. First, they can't spend the money on specifically religious activities, use it for the actual charity or social services you're supposed to be using it on and then pay for your church yourself. And second, they can't compel people receiving the government-funded services to participate in religious activities. And this is just common sense, right? All they're doing is keeping religions from misappropriating taxpayer money, or, I guess, strong-arming people receiving services into joining their religion. Same standards they hold everybody else to. You can't use taxpayer money to make a house payment, and you can't use taxpayer money to run your church. Make sense? To represent this situation as one where religious institutions just can't receive federal funding is brazenly dishonest. And when this movie tries to lie like this about what it can't do, I feel like it's trying to muddy the waters in order to argue for what it actually can't do. launder federal money into its religious activities. I can't say that's what it's trying to do. I can't say that's what any specific Christian organization wants to do. But I can't see how you would make up bullshit like this unless that was your goal. I guess unless the filmmakers are just that stupidly ignorant themselves. Now, I guess it's not technically lying to say that fictional character Pete Kane wants to do this. But that's not all these movies are doing. They're trying to represent this situation as somehow reflecting something that is happening or might happen in real life. I mean, all the movies so far literally claim this in their end credits. In fact, the movie suggests this is already happening because of how Dave's shelter got shut down. Because remember why that happened. Because of a Bible study. But was Dave using federal funds for that Bible study? No. Was he even leading the Bible study? No. It was being led independently by women who were at the shelter, and the government shut it down for that. I mean, come on, seriously. This is just stupidly unrelated to how anything happens in real life. More than that, it makes the screenwriters look just deliberately underhanded. Like, I don't want to say that they are actually, but it sure feels that way. And it makes it look like they know what the rules are and they're trying to steer Dave around them. I don't know. I guess a way to put it would be, I don't know how everything could fall into place this neatly to make Dave look this innocent just on accident. So anyway, Dave says, I'm not a politician. She says, does the country need a politician? Maybe they need something new. And it shows more kids running around being cute and playing while he's bummed that he gave it his best and they just couldn't quite make enough money. So I don't know, standard Lifetime movie bullshit, except about Christian persecution. But soon after this, my patience with all these shenanigans is finally rewarded with a big reveal of Mark Shelley. Mark Shelley, the bad guy who broke up with his girlfriend because of her cancer and who we haven't seen since God's Not Dead 1. I mean, the movie even teases this out by showing him talking on the phone from behind and then flipping to reveal his face. I mean, it wasn't super duper artfully done or well timed, but they tried and, hey, Mark Shelley. He's even talking on a phone with his feet up on a desk evil just like in the first one. He then says one door closes and another opens, then does an evil laugh and it pans back to a model of what I can only assume is the new headquarters for the Legion of Doom. So I guess at least we'll get some fun camp in the middle of watching evangelical talking points being wedged into a made-for-TV movie. Miss J comes face to face with Happy Days, so I guess no subtle long-term build-up to this confrontation, and he makes sure we know he's the hallmark bad guy by saying small towns are dumpy and also insulting how she's aged because, obviously he's improving like a fine wine. Meanwhile, Mr. Smith is keeping up the recruiting effort on Dave with a "you're a small-town pastor with nothing to lose" speech, which would be boring on a good day, but then he has to throw in some standard bullshit about how nobody wants to tell the truth because it gets them canceled. I mean, Jesus Christ, I keep trying to progress through this movie without stopping to say something every 30 seconds, and they just won't stop throwing these passive-aggressive little jabs. Of course, Dave's a reluctant hero about it because, no ambition or Project 2025 for him. A point the movie delivers with about half the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Like seriously, full-on dramatic music with a montage of flashbacks. 20 minutes into the movie and we're already flashing back to previous scenes to make our point. Dave wakes up the next morning to more dramatic music playing, and in fact the music is so dramatic that he chases her down at the airport instead of, calling her or something. She asks what he's doing there. I don't know, you tell us, movie's hardened political strategist. And he agrees to run for Congress. Of course he has to do it her way, so no foreshadowing potential tension there. Then when he says goodbye to her, we see that her driver is the rental car guy and theater waiter from the earlier movies. Like, yay, another callback to another character. But then they have to spoil it with this drawn-out back-and-forth explanation of who he is.
Don't I know you?
Well, it's quite possible. I'm actually a fairly successful stage actor.
Yeah. No, you're a waiter.
Well, that too.
Like, seriously, movie? Those of us who know, and those who need it explained to them aren't going to care anyway. Geez, whatever, you guys are so bad at this. Happy Days announces to Kane that Pastor Dave is running, and there's more explicit callback to the relationship from God's Not Dead 2, for audience members who won't understand or appreciate it. And then the characters decide to do the separation of church and state dance. Just to make it clear that separation of church and state is just a disingenuous routine that liberal atheists do and not one of the most important bedrocks of our democracy. Oh, and Kane's chugging alcohol too, in case we haven't made it clear that that's his personality. I guess everybody's freaked out that Miss Lottie J is running his campaign to make sure that we understand what a legend she is, and Happy Days hints that he's going to bury her. Melodrama, melodrama, melodrama. Next is a big pivotal scene where Dave appears on Mike Huckabee on the way in meeting the newsboys who aren't as much a callback as a persistent annoying presence in this franchise. And just to reinforce that these are good, family-loving Christians, Miss J stops to look at a picture of her son, which we never see the atheist doing fancy that. Dave's appearance is all pretty mundane stuff like platitudes about Christianity and how people are looking for spiritual leadership. Not sure whether that's true or what spiritual leadership is supposed to mean, especially as related to the role of organized fundamentalist religion and government. But I guess it doesn't matter because the audience will lap it up without a thought. And by the way, Mike Huckabee throws in that there are more ordained ministers in Congress now than at any other point in U.S. history, a claim that's meaningless in any sense because there's no clearly defined numbers on that topic. And the only thing I actually could find was that as of 2015 and I think 2020, Congress had one more clergy member than the original Congress of 1789, which sounds like something until you realize that Congress only had 91 members as opposed to our current 535 members. So proportionally, the original Congress had 7 times as many clergy members as ours does today, which, if anything, makes it a clear indicator of how secularized our government's become. Like, seriously, how does this fact slip by you unless you're just brazenly cherry-picking information to make the point you want to make? I don't know. This is the kind of sleaze that just shows me how fundamentally insincere the God's Not Dead project is. But back to Dave's real point, what he tries to get at is that the whole idea of separation of church and state is fuzzy, and nobody can leave their moral values out of politics, including religious people. But it's not fuzzy. Like, not at all. There's a pretty clear divide between legislation based on an understanding of demonstrable consequences of our actions and legislation based on theology. Like, imagine the difference between a Muslim congressman proposing a law against murder and a law against eating pork. Or a Catholic proposing a law against theft versus a law requiring you to confess your sins to a priest instead of directly to God. Or an ultra-fundamentalist proposing a law against speeding versus a law against reading any version of the Bible other than the King James. One of these columns promotes the clear, secularly understandable public good, while the other is just based on religious dictate. One of these columns can be rightly imposed by a lawmaker who happens to be religious, and the other is a lawmaker who's out of line because they're legislating as a member of that religion. I mean, not all examples are as obvious as these, but I think you get what I mean. With just the tiniest bit of reflection, you could get at least some sense of the difference between these two things and understand how a pastor could participate in politics without pushing for theocracy. But this doesn't seem to be the kind of basic reflection that this movie or evangelicals in general are interested in. And this act of throwing up your hands and saying, well, values are complicated, what can we do, is a deliberately negligent, if not cynical way of muddying the waters to get theocracy in the door. Of course, Dave goes off script when he starts getting too real with his pastor talk, which results in 2 things happening. One, Miss J gets mad because he didn't follow her instructions. So once again, this movie shows absolutely no patience for paying off a situation it had set up. And Kane clips his comments and uses them all out of context for an attack ad. Yeah, their side takes things out of context and fake news and so on. Pretty standard stuff they've been using to undermine truth for years now. One telling thing is this ad shows January 6 footage of Christians with no takeaway other than Kane's using this against us, so I guess enjoy that fun fact. Then a few minutes later, Dave gives us this standard line. The Founding Fathers were clear about their intentions concerning separation of church and state. It wasn't so much about keeping religion out of the government, it was more about keeping the government out of religion. Now this might be the single dumbest statement in the history of public discourse, because these are not 2 different ideas. As soon as one religion gets involved in government, then that government by definition is involved in other people's practice of religion. That's what religious involvement in government does and is intended to do. Make the government a partisan actor on behalf of that religion at the expense of other religions. And I know anybody, including Pastor Dave and PureFlix, would be acutely aware of this problem if it was any religion other than theirs in charge. This is just brazenly trying to obscure the problem of mixing church and state because it's their religion and they want that level of authority. Kane's retort, of course, is filled with loaded language, saying Dave would govern based on superstition, fear, and ignorance. But the problem in this case is not that Christianity is ignorant or superstitious per se. It's that they want to guide people's behavior based on religious principles, and you can't compel other people, at least by law, to follow your religious principles. That's the actual problem. But it seems like this movie doesn't want its audience to come to terms with it, so it just has Kane, address the issue in language that's so offensive and is going to get them so on guard that they just don't even think about it. Again, it's just trying to divert from the actual issues. Kane then says the country should be run by academics and scholars, not anybody's actual stance, but it preps the audience for authoritarian populism, and of course cuts the mic off before Dave can respond with meaningless over-the-pulpit fluff. Kind of thing his audience will think means he won. This, of course, leads to the standard play dirty or be idealistic thing from every political movie, so cool, When these movies aren't irritating me with their Christian nationalism, they're boring me with their made-for-TV drama. Oh, and soon we learn in formulaic fashion that Happy Days had used Miss J for a distraction and to get political intel. He calls and tries to hit on her, then evil villain laughs when she says she wants a real debate. So, whatever. On the other side of things, Mark Shelley offers to fund Dave's campaign in exchange for cutting regulations, introducing more play dirty or be idealistic stuff. Because, Dave wouldn't be a standard Republican who would want to cut regulations anyway. Also, Miss J keeps telling Dave to cut down on all the Jesus talk because they live in an opposite world where pandering to Christians doesn't get you elected. After more tedious Miss J and Happy Days drama, we get a musical sequence where people put up signs for Dave's campaign and start setting up his office, and then we fade to Dave making bland populist political statements while his numbers steadily go up. So fine, I guess. He's idealistic and his good-hearted, common-sense message resounds, and we're going to show that through a montage while everybody gushes over him. I guess there are two ways of looking at this. One, it's just purely indulgent on Dave's part. He has this Neil Breen thing where he has to show himself being the perfect hero and everybody loving him. The other is a little more dangerous and insidious, and that would be communicating how good-hearted Christians have the actual real message, and if only that could get out to the people, everybody would love it. So, it'd be so great if we, the real people with a real honest message, could run things instead of those people. This leads Kane and Happy Days to decide they just really need to finish Dave now that he has money. Because if there's one thing we shouldn't have seen coming, it's a conservative Christian candidate having money. Just more painting our side as the underdog, Y-A-W-N, yawn. And so I guess now we have our big debate. And it's built up to be all dramatic and exciting, but I have a feeling that deep down, even most invested Christians would be a little bored. Because even though you want to rah-rah he's going to win, I think you on some level know that they're both just going to say the same things you've already heard them say. Just my impression based on my experience watching this movie and also my memories of seeing stuff like this when I was a Christian. And it turns out this debate is more of the same. Keep your religion in church, blah, blah. Society needs more moral guidance, blah, blah. The government should help people, blah, blah. You're all just for big government, blah, blah. But then we get to a really egregious line that I remember from the trailer. Kane mentions that something Dave said is textbook Christian nationalism, and Dave just says, whenever anyone of faith promotes a policy you don't like, you label them a Christian nationalist. And come on, Dave. And I guess at this point I'm unconsciously talking both to character Dave and David Arrowhite of Pure Flix. There is such a thing as Christian nationalism, and you know it. Or if somehow you don't know it in your current position at your current level of activism, you are being willfully ignorant. In fact, Dave gives an example that can help clarify both this issue and why he should know better. If a mother is concerned about a book being appropriate for her child to read, that is not necessarily Christian nationalism. Number one, that parent is not necessarily setting public policy, and number two, her concerns might be based on actual valid issues of what's developmentally appropriate for children. However, if someone, possibly including a group of parents, pushes for laws restricting books with developmentally appropriate, non-explicit pictures of gay people because it goes against their scriptures, that is Christian nationalism. Get it, Dave? Well, no, of course he doesn't get it because he's all about lying about the fact that Christian nationalism exists. Get out of here with your obfuscating bullshit. The rest of this is just basic jingoism, including the mind-numbingly stupid if you don't like in God we trust on money then spend less of it. But I don't have time to break that all down and I'm sure you get the flavor of it. Afterward, Kane accosts Dave off stage and yells at him in a scene reticent of Professor Radisson grabbing Josh in the hallways after class, so whatever, I guess. Just a signal that he knows he's getting owned by a Christian and can't handle the truth. Miss J finds dirt on Kane, but we get hints that it's sketchier might backfire, so surprise, surprise, going negative might be the wrong answer. And Dave, of course, is still pure as the driven snow, so he tells her to throw it away. You know the drill. A young woman who clearly doesn't act for a living comes and tells Dave that the government is kicking them out of their shelter, not something they do just because they withdrew funding, and that Dave is focusing too much on politics instead of helping the women. So I guess we're manufacturing that artificial tension. Then we learn that the dirt on Kane we thought might backfire backfired. What? Because it was all forged and now Dave is accused of fraud. We're meant to think it was Miss J, but turns out it was Happy Days. And he and Kane celebrate with inexplicable shirts and, of course, alcohol. Of course, when Dave's at his lowest point, who shows up to lift his spirits? You haven't watched a God's Not Dead movie if you don't know it's Minority Encouragement sidekick number 2, Martin. But oops, he's not there to encourage him, which is what I seriously thought was going on, but to tell him the church board suspended him and to take away his keys. So more of the hesitant political hero thing, this time I think coded as, Trump gave it all for the good of the country. I mean, they don't say it that explicitly, but do you think that idea is not going to seep into the minds of this audience? And if that was too subtle, Dave walks home in the rain. And if that was too subtle, his driver announces the rain. And if that was still too subtle, he walks by a condemn sign on the door of his women's shelter. Not something I'd assumed automatically happens when an organization stops receiving federal funding, but okay. After he gets home, Mr. Smith shows up. Oops, forgot he had a third Minority Encouragement sidekick. And Dave complains about everything that's happening. Apparently, he might have to move and face criminal charges. Like, the optics of the information suddenly appearing are one thing, but actually being able to trace this back to Dave in a court of law are another. I don't know. It just seems like these movies throw sloppy handsful of consequences at the audience for emotional effect and don't really think through anything. Smith comes back with some generic Christian encouragement, like any good Minority Encouragement sidekick would. But then he says something weird. It's something that's repeated in text at the end of the movie, so you know it's a big deal. And that is that 40 million Christians don't vote and 15 million don't even register. Now, this sounds like a big deal, but when you do the math, given the number of American adults in this country, American Christian adults in this country, actually a much higher percentage of Christians, according to what he said, vote than the average population. At its highest, the general eligible population that voted in a national election was 66% in 2020. According to Smith's numbers, about 75 to 77% of people vote, depending on what numbers you find. I messed up there. I didn't mean 75 to 77% of people. I meant 75 to 77% of Christians. And this, by contrast, is 66% of the general population in the highest turnout election, with those numbers usually in the 50s or low 60s. So again, this is just an example of this movie apparently dishonestly giving cherry-picked numbers to make a point. I'd always instinctively thought that evangelical Christians were one of the most active voting blocs and one of the most organized political forces. And so this whole 40 million of you don't vote, it seems like kind of a false representation of Christians not being involved in politics. But when I went and looked this up, I don't know if this data clearly shows they're more involved, but it feels a little sketchy. I don't know. It does seem, according to the formula, that Dave responds positively to Smith's encouragement. And so this, I think, is the end of his low point. I started watching just after this to where he starts to turn things around and come back. I'm going to have to cut off recording just for the moment now and save the rest for a later date of recording. You won't notice the difference, except I might look a little different when I come back. I'm between recording sessions right now, but I just thought about something from the last scene that I wanted to add, which is that when Smith went to Dave's house, he brought along a pine cone in a bag. Why? To provide what evangelical culture thinks a metaphor is. That being an insultingly obvious object lesson. Basically, this specific pine cone needs to burn before it can release its seeds, so... Get it? It means that Dave needs to go through the metaphorical fire before he can achieve his purpose. I bothered stopping to bring this up because, 1, this shot of the cone burning looks really cool and I wanted to offer this movie a sincere compliment when the opportunity arose, and 2, this scene really tells us something about how evangelicalism processes ideas and what it thinks a well-thought-out conclusion is. C. Smith, and by extension this movie, thought this illustration was so revelatory that it was worth physically getting a hold of a pine cone, carrying it to someone's house in a paper bag, and throwing it into a fire. But for all that trouble, what did this actually tell us? Sometimes you have to go through difficult times to see a good outcome? Great. That's true, but it's an incredibly basic thing that every functional adult and most functional children already know, and it doesn't flesh out any intelligent nuance of which hard things are important to go through, how you decide they'll actually lead to a better, worthwhile outcome, or when enough is enough. The actual adult process of weighing pros and cons that will help you make an informed, if possibly uncertain decision. But this movie doesn't get into any of that. And sure, that could just be chalked up to lazy screenwriting. I get that. But there's something deeply evangelical about this process of hearing a basic, pious-sounding truism, feeling like it neatly sums up a complex issue, and then charging headfirst into what intuitively feels like God's will. It's an imprecise way of making decisions that leaves you at the mercy of either your gut or manipulative religious leaders, and it feels like it really captures the core of these movies' rhetoric and how they encourage people to think. I don't know, I just thought that was worth stopping and bringing up real quick. At headquarters the next day, Dave is talking with his staff, apparently about his decision to stay in the race even though this is never made clear, so the scene starts off disorienting, and they're trying to figure out what to do with the whole scandal. One of his strategists tells him, just tonight you have to lie in order to preserve your image of being honest, and Dave's like, did you just hear yourself? And that conversation is so fundamental to everything God's Not Dead is that I think I'm going to stick it in my back pocket and talk about it later. Of course, the point of this whole scene ends up just being that Dave is super honest. Oh boy, how totally unpredictable. He won't lie, he won't throw Miss J under the bus, and, very puzzlingly, he doesn't want to spend another penny of his campaign money. So, Dave does a press conference where he apologizes to Kane's campaign and says the political system is broken, then concludes he's going to stay in the race. Kane's watching this all on a tablet, and as soon as Dave makes this announcement, he screams, "He won't stay dead!" like a cartoonish supervillain, then slams his wine glass down on the table. Oh, did I mention Kane was drinking wine in this scene? Because he was. Anyway, Dave also insists that they hold their second debate as previously agreed. Miss J is getting ready to resign and leave town, and her driver, the theater actor guy, asks why she's leaving. She says it's all over, and he says, I'm not kidding. Well, Rev Dave's not giving up. Like, seriously, dude, are you an adult in what's supposed to be a serious movie, or an old-timey kid who still believes in his baseball hero? He tells her that running away never solves anything, it just makes you tired, and since these kinds of lines are what people's decisions pivot on in made-for-TV quality movies like these, she decides to stay in the campaign. There's a quick scene that reveals that Mark Shelley leaked the fake dirt on Kane, so I guess it wasn't Happy Days, and establishes once again how unabashedly selfish he is. Then we flash to the newsboys who are watching Dave on TV. One of them says his campaign has gone sour, and another chimes in that the internet said he was set up. And, what could ever motivate a current piece of right-wing propaganda to shoehorn in a scene like this? What could it ever gain by suggesting to its audience that a scandal involving its favorite political hero was all a setup and fake news and that the truth might be on the internet? I mean, I know I'm reading between the lines here, a little, but the more I watch this movie, the more I realize it's not just prepping its audience for Christian nationalism. It's pretty openly running interference for Trump. They even stop to pray for Dave as someone standing in the gap, and suggest the fake scandal was meant by Satan for evil and ask God to make it good. So clearly identifying politics as a spiritual good versus evil, God versus Satan thing. Nothing at all dangerous or cult-like here. Anyway, back at the Legion of Doom, Kane and Happy Days argue over whether to debate. Kane says not debating will make him look weak, and Happy Days says ignoring it will make him look confident. Turns out Kane doesn't just want to win the election, he wants to humiliate Dave as revenge for God's Not Dead 2, which is kind of fun in a silly contrived way. And he's the boss, so he's going to do it. So where could this possibly be going? Maybe all the ups and downs in the story to this point were all for nothing, and everything's going to hinge on a single all-or-nothing event where Dave turns it around with a heroic speech? I guess let's find out. Then back at a very dejected Hall of Justice, Dave tries to make coffee and it doesn't work. By the way, this movie spends a lot of time showing Miss J and now Dave having a hard time with a coffee machine, which I think is supposed to be some kind of symbol for struggling or having hard times or something, so whatever. And suddenly Miss J is there and says Mark was the one who sent the fake information in. The scene goes on way too long with literally 40 silent seconds of him just handing her coffee and sitting down uncomfortably close to her, but closer on this camera than on this one. Work on your blocking, people. And then Miss J reveals what we already knew, which is that Happy Days got her pregnant. What I should have also seen coming is that Happy Days wanted her to take care of it, because of course this movie has to shoehorn in abortion. Miss J just keeps revealing more things that have been obvious to everybody the whole time. She was hurt by Happy Days, this was about revenge for her, she didn't mean to drag a guy as amazing as Dave into it, which shows the problem with being as heavy-handed as this movie is. If you're always totally on the nose about everything, then it looks silly to have your character finally reveal something that you've been hammering your audience over the head about the whole time. Dave replies that she didn't get him into it, God did. She asks, how do you know it's God's voice? And he says, you know someone's voice when you hear it long enough. Which, considering that God's voice is just thoughts in your head, all this means is that you're cultivating a feeling that some of your thoughts came from God. I mean, whether you're a Christian or an atheist or whatever, that's literally, kind of how it works. And sorry, Dave, but I'm not going to live my life based on which of your thoughts you decided came from God. Then he uses a metaphor for being in a boat that's sinking and jumping out versus staying in. You know, the basic illustrations these movies use to get you to simple conclusions. And of course, there happens to be a picture of a boat in a storm on the wall. Next, we get flashed the words 2 days until election. And we see everybody gathering for the big debate. Like, I may be no electionologist or anything, but this debate seems weirdly close to election day. I don't know. But the point is clear. Dave's down by way too many %, and everything's going to come down to one big knock it out of the park moment where Dave's going to knock it out of the park. Like, come on, really, you think I'm wrong? By the way, we have people showing up in blue Pete Kane shirts and red Dave Hill shirts, just in case the audience wasn't quite sure enough which party this movie was telling them is angelic and which it was telling them is pure evil. Pre-debate, Dave is piously praying, and Kane shows up to mock him and cackle like a villain. Curiously, he's not holding any alcohol in this scene. And he also tries to bribe Dave into dropping out by offering to get him off the hook for fraud charges and give him his women's shelter back. Which is weird because he just finished insisting on having this debate because he wanted to not just win but humiliate Dave. Like, come on, movie, get your head in the game. Anyways, Happy Days is still hitting on Miss J, yawn, and then the debate starts. Now, there's not really a lot interesting to say about this debate because it's boring and stupid and just rehashes things the characters have been saying the whole time. And here's the problem. If your entire understanding of the debate is that the bad guys are evil and stupid and just say, hey, you can't be a politician because you're a barbaric, superstitious Christian and I hate God even though I don't believe in him, and then the good guy says, well, Christians have a right to their values and also separation of church and state as misunderstood, and also the government belongs to the people, freedom, small government, rah, 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 and then the bad guy either cheats or pees his pants and runs off crying, then what do you do over the course of a movie? How do you expound on these ideas? Build any tension or uncertainty around them? You can't, because by design there is no uncertainty. Your whole premise rests on the idea that the good guy is so obviously virtuous and good and noble and smart, and the bad guy is so depraved and dumb that everything is open and shut from the beginning. That's what you want to convey to your audience. So all you can do is bring your two rivals out to repeat the same meaningless things over and over, and since doing that doesn't impact anything, doesn't explain anything, and can't progress the plot, you just manufacture all your drama with lifetime movie twists that will never ultimately matter. Then in the end, you just show them saying the same thing again and depict the audience clapping for the good guy. So who cares? In this case, Kane says Dave's allegiance is to the church and so on. Dave says that since they already removed prayer from school, which no they didn't, imagine how bad things will get if they eliminate religious freedoms in Christianity, which is a phrase that doesn't even make semantic sense and no, nobody plans on doing that. Kane just kind of mumbles and tries to interrupt, while Dave just runs through scary buzzwords like communist China, North Korea, European socialism. Seriously, there's a sequence where he just says those words all in a row.
Think China, North Korea, European socialist.
Kane suggests that government programs are good because they look after others and asks, isn't love thy neighbor central to the teachings of Jesus? But then here Dave starts to say some bafflingly stupid things. He retorts, no, Senator, central to the teachings of Jesus is Jesus. Which literally means nothing, but everybody applauds anyway. He then says the only reason Jesus' teaching of love thy neighbor resonates is that he was the Son of God. Which no is not why it resonates. It resonates because it makes sense to people as a way for everyone to get along with stuff, and I think it also probably has some sentimental feel to it. Like seriously, if Dave heard this from anybody other than God, would he be like, what? Love your neighbor? What does that accomplish? I don't get it. It's just weird. I mean, there's a reason people pick this specifically from among the Bible's teachings over other things that, are neutral or worse. It's because they have humanist value. Whole other long conversation there. But it's just bizarre that this movie doesn't get it and Dave doesn't get it. This all leads to a climactic exchange where Kane says the country wasn't just founded on Christian principles and the founders were diverse. He talks about founding principles like all men are created equal, and then there's this pause and Dave has this big gotcha moment where he very firmly says, finish it. And the point is supposed to be that it also says endowed by their creator, and Kane skipped over that. So this movie's big finishing move is to have Dave call Kane out for pretending there isn't any deistic language in the Declaration of Independence and insinuating that the fact there is means we should be a Christian nation. Seriously, this is where the movie tells its audience the debate stands. It's not that everybody knows this language is in the Declaration of Independence, meticulously left out of the Constitution, by the way, and that an intelligent conversation has been had about what this language means as an artifact of its time. No. As surely as someone saying God bless you when they hear a sneeze means that they're a Christian, The fact that these documents refer to God-given rights means that this is supposed to be a Christian nation. And because of that, secularists try to hide the fact that this language is in these documents. What a world these filmmakers must live in inside their own heads. Also, Dave adds the dangerous idea that our rights only exist if they come from God. So we don't have any fundamental concern about the well-being of others. Oh, and the nation belongs to the people, not you. Oh, and I guess in the end it shows he won the election. And he buys back his women's shelter, guess how? By using campaign money. The movie even pauses its victory lap to have him say it's legal, which I'm not sure whether or not this is, but I wonder why this movie would go out of its way for a throwaway line meant to obscure the issue of misappropriating campaign funds. Geez, Pureflix is so filthy. Anyway, I guess the big thing is he won. Grand champion of the debating world, David A.R. Hill or whatever, won back freedom of religion in America. Okay, cool. There's not a lot to say about this because it's all just stupid and boringly predictable. Like, to pretend that these age-old tropes of church culture add anything new to the conversation, much less would serve as a slam dunk on an atheist to make up 30 points in a political race 2 days before the election, is just plain laughable. But it is a God's Not Dead movie, so I guess what were we expecting? But that's the thing about this movie. At its core, it is just amazingly simple. Whenever it has anything factual to say, it's either clearly misleading or just plain incorrect. And beyond that, it just works by showing the good guys being one-dimensionally virtuous and the bad guys being clownishly evil, and the debates are all a simple set-up-payoff affair where the bad guys say something clearly stupid and the good guys easily refute it. And this is where I want to go back to that conversation between Dave and his political advisor, because that illustrates this in just an amazingly obvious way. I mean, think about what Dave's advisor said, and I want to put it on screen. Just deny it, you have to lie in order to preserve your image of being honest. Like, nobody in real life would ever talk like this, right? They'd say, just deny it, and the rest is silly, overwritten garbage. But it's not just silly by accident. Everything about this guy's phrasing was contrived to spell out for the audience in painful detail how bald-facedly dishonest he is, how easily recognizable the inconsistency in his thinking is, just to set Dave up with the easy opportunity to say, did you just hear yourself? And isn't this just God's Not Dead in a nutshell? It solves most of its conflicts and depicts Christians as being right by having worldly people say things that not only don't make sense, but are constructed specifically to set up obvious conversational punchlines for the Christians. Then the Christians effortlessly deliver those punchlines. Or sometimes the Christians just say something clearly stupid and the audience claps anyway, and that's how we know they won. We all know this is stupid, but the problem is it encourages the movie's intended audience to see the world the way it probably already does. As a completely non-nuanced place where all the answers are obvious, the Christians are clearly right and everybody else is clearly wrong. And what's the point of that other than for self-reinforcing propaganda? Now, before we finish, I want to go back to the movie's opening montage, something I had skipped because I actually wanted to spend some more time on it. Because that's where this movie is most creepily open about its extremist agenda and how far it has gone down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole. It starts with snippets from political speeches intercut with Dave's rant from God's Not Dead 4 about left-wing atheists wanting to take away our freedom. And that's all bad enough. But where it really blows its dog whistle the loudest is in its choice of what stock footage to play over this. First, look what it shows us when it's talking about taking away our freedoms. Of course, there's COVID stuff. We have a nurse wearing a mask, which is a weird choice for stock footage about mask mandates. Signs showing churches closed for the pandemic, because it was all about picking on churches. And footage of people getting their shots, because of course we're in bed with the anti-vax community. But then there's incredibly random stuff like the word evolution being written on a chalkboard and someone checking atheist on a demographics form. But there's no reason to play this over talk about people taking away our freedom unless you recognize that these are signifiers of other kinds of people and want to suggest to your audience that everybody outside your circle is a threat. Then it plays Reagan basically saying that everything goes to shit if people don't believe in God over footage of protests and or riots. Protests and riots being the same thing in this movie's minds, at least when it's not them doing it, January 6th. And all this culminates in a badly After Effects image of a church burning. So why this escalation from protest to church burning? Well, I think it's pretty much just obvious persecution garbage, right? We all get that. Basically, it's trying to insinuate that every bit of unrest in our society not only isn't justified, but is all a big giant attack on the church. Everything that's happening is because people don't believe in God and ultimately trying to attack people who believe in God. Not a healthy way to think, right? Now, let's just say you don't need to agree with everything about COVID, lockdowns, protests, vaccines, Jesus Christ, but you should at least try to understand what these positions are and what concerns lie behind them. Maybe people concerned about public health are just concerned about public health. Maybe people who protest, even riot, are just speaking out in what Martin Luther King called the language of the unheard after being pushed past the point of desperation for reasons you've probably never bothered to understand. Because remember Martin Luther King? That guy you cheaply appropriated for your opening sequence? He did say words other than I have a dream and not the color of their skin, but the content of their character. But the point is, even if you don't agree with people's positions, you need to at least give them the basic respect of recognizing where they're coming from. And this movie has no intention of doing that. In fact, it seems dead set on doing the opposite, reducing all these people to boogeymen who just want to destroy the church. This is pretty neatly codified when the movie plays Ronald Reagan saying, "If we ever forget that we are one nation under God, we will be a nation gone under," while we watch footage of chaos and burning churches. This poses a problem. Some people are enemies of our religion or, don't have godly principles, and in order to fix it, we need to be a nation under God. But how do we become a nation under God? Basically, that amounts to everybody unifying behind my religion. That's it. So here's the problem. What about people who don't want to unify behind your religion? What happens to them? The only way I can see this as a solution is as some call to theocracy. Now, a person might say, well, actually, this is just suggesting that we need to put Christianity out there and let the obvious appeal of it, draw everybody in. Then we'll all voluntarily be a nation under God. But that's clearly not happened. There are a lot of people who already are aware of Christianity and have been for years, whether they are non-believers or just vaguely spiritual or members of another religion. They've known Christianity is out there, and they have not become one nation under God. So clearly there are people who just don't want to join your religion. Sorry, Christians. And so I can only take this, especially in a political movie or in something that involves Christians getting into politics, as some kind of call to theocracy. Don't know any other way to see it. And in fact, considering how this opening and this movie in general portrays this all as a big emergency, everybody's attacking the church. You won't even have time to get your kid and run for the hills when the secularists take over. This is portrayed as such a huge emergency that just go witness to people and hope they become Christians feels like a very flaccid and inadequate reaction. And I don't think that's what this movie is encouraging its audience to go for. I definitely don't think that's what this audience is going to go for. So really, at its core, this movie is just totally Christian nationalist. It wants to deny that Christian nationalism exists, but it wants to bring Christianity into the public sphere and into politics as a solution to all our problems, and that necessarily is going to involve Christian nationalism. It's obvious. This movie has gone way, way off the deep end. This franchise has. And I think, of course, as we've started to see MAGA arise and Trumpism arise, we've seen either David A.R. White and this franchise get more extreme or just reveal that they've always been extreme. But whatever. This movie's kind of rough. Don't know how else to put it. It encourages very simplified thinking in its audience. And all of this, in the end, ends up being driven toward thinking that if other people disagree with you, something is very wrong with them and they are malicious and they need to be bent to our will and made to become like us, become part of our religion. So that was God's Not Dead 5. I hope you enjoyed my review. I'll see you next time, everybody.